The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from Alara's bones. It howled across the blighted plains, a ceaseless lament that scoured the land and stripped the trees bare, leaving them like skeletal fingers clawing at a gunmetal sky. For 3 days, that wind had been her only companion, its voice a constant reminder of all she had lost. Her husband taken by the fever, her small plot of land, seized by men whose sympathy was thinner than winter ice. Her dignity, eroded with every pitying glance and whispered judgment in the town she no longer called home. Now, there was nothing left but the gnawing hollowness in her belly and the grit of dust between her teeth. She stumbled, her worn leather boots catching on a half-buried stone. The impact sent a jarring shock up her leg, and she nearly pitched forward into the dirt. Ahead, a plume of smoke, thin and gray, rose against the oppressive horizon. It was the only sign of life she had seen since dawn, a fragile thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. She had been warned about this place. The solitary man who lived there, Silas, a recluse. 7 years he'd kept to himself, a ghost on the edge of the world, nursing some private grief the town gossips could only guess at. They called him strange, even dangerous. But the gnawing hunger was a more immediate danger, a more visceral terror than any rumored madness. As she drew closer, the homestead resolved itself from the haze. A small, sturdy cabin of dark, weathered logs, a stoic barn, and a fenced pasture where 2 brindled cows stood, their backs to the wind. The sight of them sent a peculiar pang through her, not of hunger, but of purpose. It was a memory, a muscle-deep familiarity from her girlhood on her father's farm. The rhythmic pull, the frothing warmth of milk in a pail, the sweet, grassy scent of a contented animal. It was a language she knew. It was all she had left to offer. Fear coiled in her gut as she approached the cabin, her knuckles hovering before the solid wood of the door. This was the end of the line. If he turned her away, the wind would have her before morning. She could already feel the cold seeping in, a final, fatal chill. Taking a ragged breath that tasted of dust and desperation, she knocked. The sound was swallowed by the gale. She knocked again, harder, the rap of her knuckles a frantic heartbeat against the silence of the house. The door opened a crack. A sliver of a man appeared, a beard threaded with gray, eyes the color of a stormy sea, deep-set and wary. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her tattered dress, her chapped face. The desperation she knew was etched into every line of her body. He had the stillness of a man long accustomed to solitude, a stillness that felt like a wall. Alara's voice, when it came, was a dry rasp. "Sir," she cleared her throat, forcing the words out past the lump of fear. "I mean no trouble. I saw you have cows." Her gaze flickered towards the pasture. "I can milk them. I can tend them. I'm a good worker." She held up her hands, palms out, trying to show they were capable, not just begging. "For a meal, a place in the barn out of the wind. That's all I ask." Silas's expression did not change. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind's mournful cry. He was a fortress and she was a beggar at the gates. This was it, the final rejection. She felt the last of her strength begin to fray, the world tilting at the edges. But then, after a lifetime of waiting, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He opened the door wider, stepping back into the shadows of the cabin. It was not a welcome, it was a concession. For Alara, stumbling over the threshold from the biting wind into the dim, quiet warmth, it was the first breath after drowning. The arrangement was one of unspoken rules, carved from silence and necessity. Silas pointed her to a clean stall in the barn, hay piled in a corner for a bed. He left a tin plate of stew and a chunk of hard bread on a barrel head that first evening, and vanished back into the cabin without a word. Alara ate with the ravenous, near-painful urgency of a starving animal, the savory warmth of the stew a shock to her system. That night, burrowed in the hay with a coarse wool blanket she found folded nearby, she listened to the wind shrieking outside the barn walls and felt a profound, aching gratitude for the simple fact of shelter. He had not turned her away. It was enough. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the two cows, Mercy and Grace. She rose before dawn, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and made her way to the pasture. The animals came to know her, greeting her with low, soft moos, their large, dark eyes placid. Milking them was a meditation. The steady, rhythmic work soothed the frantic terror that had lived in her chest for weeks. It was honest labor, a fair trade. She poured the frothing milk into his pails, leaving them by the cabin door, and he would leave her food in return. They rarely spoke. A nod in the morning, a monosyllabic grunt of acknowledgement. She learned the landscape of his back, the set of his shoulders as he chopped wood or mended a fence. He was a man made of competence and silence. From her vantage in the barn, she watched him. She saw the way his calloused hands could be gentle as he reshod his horse. She saw the deep weariness that settled on him when he thought no one was looking, a profound loneliness that resonated with her own. She noticed the small grave on the hill behind the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered by 7 years of sun and snow. She did not need to ask. She understood. Grief was a language they both spoke fluently, and their silence was a shared dialect. One afternoon, she found a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt, left draped over a fence post. She took it back to her stall and, using a small sewing kit from her meager bundle of possessions, mended it with neat, precise stitches. She left it folded where she had found it. The next day, an extra apple appeared beside her dinner plate. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Slowly, the barn began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a part of her world. The fear that had been a constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. She was earning her keep. She was surviving. One evening, a sudden, violent squall blew in, the rain coming down in freezing sheets. The cabin door opened. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the warm light from his hearth. He just looked at her, then jerked his head toward the house. Alara gathered her blanket and walked across the muddy yard, her heart hammering. Inside, the cabin was sparse but immaculate. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He gestured for her to sit on a small stool by the fire, then resumed his seat in a worn armchair, turning his attention to carving a piece of wood. The silence in the small room was different from the silence of the yard. It was warmer, heavier, filled with the unspoken histories of two fractured lives. He had let her in, not just into his house, but past the first layer of his solitude. The simple act of sharing the warmth of his fire felt more profound than any conversation. The thaw between them was as slow and quiet as the coming of spring. It was not in words, but in deeds. He began leaving the cabin door unlocked during the day. She began tending the small vegetable patch near the house, her hands reacquainting themselves with the soil. One day he spoke her name. Alara, the sound of it, in his low, rough voice, was startling. She turned from the milk pails. He held out a worn leather-bound book. You might find this of interest. It was a book of poetry. That night, by the light of the lantern he had given her for the barn, she read the verses, her fingers tracing the words. It was another piece of him, a glimpse into the man who existed before the 7 years of silence. The next morning she returned it. It was beautiful, she said, her voice soft. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than wariness in his eyes. A flicker of connection, a shared understanding. They were two solitary ships who had found a strange, safe harbor in one another's quiet company. He was no longer just the recluse, and she was no longer just the beggar. They were simply Silas and Alara, weathering the same storm under the same roof. The peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. It broke on a Tuesday, when the sky was a placid, indifferent blue. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms hardening into a familiar, dreaded shape as they approached. Alara recognized the man in the lead instantly. Jebediah Cole, his face fleshy and smug, his eyes holding the acquisitive gleam of a carrion bird. He was the one who had been quickest to circle her property after her husband's passing. his condolences slick with opportunism. He and his cronies had been the loudest voices casting her out, painting her destitution as a moral failing. Seeing them here, at the edge of her fragile sanctuary, sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. Silas emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved to stand slightly in front of her, his body a silent, solid shield. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence as a tangible warmth at her back. "Cole," he said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "Silas," Jebediah sneered, his gaze sliding past him to fix on Alara. "Hiding strays now, are we? Heard she'd run off. Looks like she ran right to the town ghoul." His men chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "We've come on behalf of the town council. Concerns have been raised. A lone woman, with a man of your reputation. She's under my protection," Silas stated. It was not a plea or a debate. It was a fact immutable as the mountains behind them. Jebediah's face darkened. "That land she was on, it's ours now. But she took things. Things that belonged to us. It was a lie, brazen and ugly. She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bundle of keepsakes." He was manufacturing a pretense, a justification for what he truly wanted, to assert his power, to drag her back into humiliation. "We're here to collect." "There's nothing to collect," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. She would not let him think her weak. "Not here. Not anymore." "We'll be the judge of that," Jebediah said, swinging down from his horse. His two men followed suit, their movements swaggering and confident. They started towards the cabin. In a flash, Silas moved. He did not raise his voice or make a threat. He simply picked up the heavy splitting axe that rested against the woodpile. He didn't lift it to swing, but held it loosely in one hand, its weight a silent promise. "You're not setting foot in my house for 7 years." He had been a ghost, a man who retreated from the world. Now, confronted with a threat to the quiet life he had rebuilt, the ghost became flesh and blood and cold, hard iron. One of Jebediah's men, emboldened by drink or stupidity, lunged forward. Silas sidestepped with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard, physical labor. He didn't use the blade of the axe. He used its solid haft, bringing it around in a short, brutal arc that connected with the man's side. The man crumpled with a grunt of pain, clutching his ribs. The second man hesitated, his bravado evaporating. Jebediah's face contorted with rage. He reached for the pistol tucked in his belt. "You'll regret that, old man," but before he could draw it, Alara acted. Her fear had burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp fury. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet she'd been scrubbing by the water pump and threw it with all her might. It spun through the air, catching Jebediah squarely on the wrist. He cried out, his hand flying open, the pistol thudding into the dust. The confrontation hung in the balance, a breath held between violence and retreat. Silas took a deliberate step forward, the axe now held at the ready. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on Jebediah, and in them was a promise of a violence he had held in check for 7 long years. Jebediah stared from Silas's unyielding face to his man groaning on the ground, then to his own throbbing wrist. The fight went out of him. He saw he had misjudged the man and the woman. Cursing, he helped his winded man to his feet, grabbed his pistol, and hauled himself back onto his horse. "This isn't over," he spat, but his words were hollow, defeated. They rode away, their retreat hasty and ignominious. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. The dust settled. The wind whispered through the dry grass. Alara stood breathing heavily, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Silas slowly lowered the axe, resting its head on the ground. He turned to her. His face was grim, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to have softened. He looked at the iron skillet lying in the dirt, then back at her. A hint of something, respect, surprise, perhaps even a shadow of a smile, touched his lips. He had not fought for himself. He had fought for their shared peace. And she, who had arrived with nothing, had fought for it too. In the crucible of that confrontation, Their unspoken pact had been forged into something stronger, something unbreakable. They had faced the world together and they had won. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new quiet settled over the homestead. It was not the silence of solitude or caution, but of shared understanding. Silas retrieved the skillet, his calloused fingers brushing against hers as he handed it back. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the line they had crossed together. He had defended her. She had defended him. They were a fortress of two. Later that day, he gestured for her to follow him inside the cabin, not just for shelter from the evening chill, but for good. He pointed to a small cot in the corner, which he had clearly just assembled. "The barn is too cold," was all he said. It was his way of saying, "This is your home now." That evening, they sat by the fire, the space between them no longer a gulf of strangeness, but a comfortable proximity. The shadows danced on the log walls, the firelight warming her face. He was oiling a piece of leather, his movements methodical and sure. She was mending a seam in her dress, the simple, domestic act feeling like a reclamation of her life. The world outside, with its cruel judgments and grasping men like Jebediah, felt a universe away. This small cabin, which had once seemed the intimidating lair of a mysterious recluse, was now the safest place on earth. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room. "I buried my wife and daughter on that hill," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Fever took them. Same week." He did not elaborate, did not drown the confession in sentiment. He stated it as a fact, a piece of his history he was now willing to share. He was entrusting her with the source of his 7-year pain. Alara stopped her sewing, her heart aching with a familiar sorrow. She looked from his stoic profile to the dancing flames. "My David," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. "He built our house with his own hands. When he was gone, it was just wood and nails." She finally understood the core of him. His solitude wasn't madness. It was a vigil. His silence wasn't hostility. It was a shield for a wound that had never healed. They had both lost their anchors and been set adrift. Now, it seemed their drifting had led them to the same shore. He looked up from his work, his stormy eyes meeting hers across the hearth. He saw not a stray, not a burden, but a woman who understood the language of loss. A survivor, partner. "You should stay," he said, the words simple but holding the weight of a lifetime. "I will," she replied, her voice steady and sure. It was not a promise made from desperation, but from choice. The hollow space inside her, carved out by grief and fear, was beginning to fill with something new, a quiet strength, a sense of belonging. The next morning, she rose and went not to the pasture, but to the cabin door. She did not wait for him to leave her a plate. She went inside and began to prepare their breakfast. When Silas entered from the barn, the smell of coffee and frying bacon met him. He stopped in the doorway, watching her move about the small kitchen as if she had always been there. A look of profound peace settled on his face, easing the harsh lines etched by years of loneliness. The hell of his solitude was over, broken not by a storm or a sermon, but by a humble offer to milk cows. Together, they had transformed a desolate shelter into a home, and in doing so, had found a way to heal themselves. As the sun rose, casting a golden light over the plains, Alara looked out the window at the land that had once terrified her. It no longer seemed like a threat, but a promise. It was their land now, a kingdom of two souls who had found resilience in ruin and a home in each other.